Hi, this is Dave McComb, Semantic Arts. We just finished one project where we used a lot of IDs in GIST, and we're just starting another one, and I thought I would just jot down a few thoughts here about why we do things the way we do and how to use GIST if you're using identifiers. I guess the first thing to mention here is that it may seem sort of odd to be talking about having identifiers in GIST because everything in semantic technology already has identifiers. They have URIs. Every object, every subject, every predicate even already has an identifier. Why do we need a class of identifiers? And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about and what some of the other options are. The two other main options, almost every other ontology we've looked at uses data types for identifiers, in addition to URIs, of course. But we're going to talk about what does it look like to have IDs as what we would call first-class instances in their own right. So, as we recall, everything's a URI, and a URI, shorthand there on the left, longer hand, looks a lot like a URL. There's a lot of things you can do with that. There are some restrictions. There are some restrictions as to what kind of characters can go in a URI. You can't have spaces and certain special characters now. They don't show up that often in identifiers, but that's one concern. Another one is, we shouldn't really be parsing the URI itself for end users to use. We should have traditional identifiers that we can do all the normal processing we do with. But the real downside is what happens if you end up with many URIs that refer to the same thing. And the standard answer in semantics is have a same as, and that's actually a great answer if you've harvested two URIs, which are identifying two things that you discover to be the same thing. You really have no other choice but to snap them together with a same as. But really, we shouldn't be inflicting that on ourselves. A lot of the inference engines and reasoners don't perform especially well with lots and lots of same as's. We create problems for ourselves when we're trying to figure out which of the aliases should we attach a property to. All sorts of interesting problems and reasons that if you don't have to, let's not overly rely on same as. We'd like to have an internal identifier that represents something like a person, an organization, and then attach identifiers to that as need be. So the first thing that would come to mind, and the first thing that pretty much everybody does, and many ontologies have this, is a data type property. And I've made a little example here. If we thought of it, we might create a social security number as a data type, and a driver's license number, and a person ID, etc., etc. And pretty soon you start realizing you may end up with many of these. Here's a healthcare company we're working with. We've got already over a dozen identifiers just for physicians, UPINs and NPIs and DEAs and SSNs and all that kind of stuff. And the downside to that is anybody who's consuming this ontology needs to know the name of all of those data type properties. And if you have 10 and then you add an 11th, they can't know that. If they had a query, how would they know to go rewrite their query and find that 11th one? It's just adding a lot of conceptual overhead where it's not needed. So our approach in GIST is to have a class, the GIST ID class, which we can see right here in Visio. Very simple. The unique text is the identifier itself. It's a tiny form of content. It's just a little tiny identifier. It's only one string. And what the one or two other things that are interesting about it, it was created by somebody. In fact, almost all the identifiers you're going to deal with in your systems that that you want to care about here were assigned by someone else, and you may want to keep track of that. For instance, the Social Security number was assigned by the Social Security Administration. The driver's license number was assigned by your local state driver's license number. All those ones that I showed for the physicians were assigned by different organizations for different purposes. And so not only do we want to keep track of who's assigning them, we want to have some way to keep them separate, because, somebody might literally accidentally use the same number for a DEA number as was used for Social Security number, and obviously they don't mean it to be the same person. So the only other thing that is kind of interest, we introduced the identified by property. It's inverse functional, meaning that an identifier will not identify two different people. And it has an inverse called identifies. So we could look at any ID and figure out what is it pointing to, what person or organization or physical property or whatever the thing is identifying. And that's pretty much it. It was allocated by someone, and it has some text. That is the sum total of GIST ID. It's dead easy. So let me be clear about just how this works. So you'll have a person with any kind of entity, but in this case a person with a URI, and if they have three identifiers, there'll be three identifier objects, each of which will be wired up with the GIST identified by property, each of which will have been allocated by someone. Let's say this is a Social Security number. It's allocated by the Social Security Administration, driver's license number, another system like Epic, each of which will use the GIST allocated by to say what entity came up with this ID, and there's the actual ID itself. So any query just has to query for identified by and a text. If you're interested in where it came from, you could add that in. If we add a third or fourth or fifth or 10th identifier, they just all come together in a bag, which is going to be very handy for a service-oriented architecture or something like that, where you want to keep track of all the aliases. And just to be clear, whoops, this should have been person 2. If you have a second person here, they'll have another identifier. We obviously reuse the who it was that allocated this number, but they get their own ID. We say there's a little bit of thought process as to exactly when should you use this, and essentially we've kind of come to the position that if the identifier is externally generated and maintained, probably a good idea to create one of these to represent that, and especially if you believe that you're going to end up with more than one of these identifiers for any given individual or organization or physical product in your system. For anything that's purely internal, if you're minting the URI, for instance, for a purchase order number, transaction record, or any of those things that we create internally, there's not literally a need to create an ID record for everything. I mean, the URI is fine for that purpose. And one of the nice things, if you later decide that there's a need to have a more formalized, externalizable identifier, you can just add it on to transactions that already exist, purchase orders that already exist, etc., etc. So that's it. Thanks, and that's why GIST ID is the way it is. Thanks.